Hello, everyone. I am Murtada Mohammed, President of the World Affairs Council of Austin, joining you tonight from Austin, Texas. Welcome back to another episode of WorldNow with Jim Falk, hosted by the World Affairs Council of Connecticut in partnership with Global Santa Fe, World Affairs Council of Austin, and with all the partners that you see on the screen. We are joined tonight by Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. Before I turn it over to Jim, I'd like to remind all our attendees from around the country to please put your questions in the Q&A box. Once again, I'd like to welcome everyone joining us tonight, and it is my pleasure to turn it over to our host, Jim Falk. Jim?
Thank you so much, Murtada. It's great to see you, and thank you and your council for being a new subscriber and a partner for WorldNow. And it is such a joy to have with us my friend Stephen Cook. Stephen, I've been waiting for this book for a very long time. And I can imagine how your publisher deals with, and you, with the changes in the Middle East, but welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Before we really get started in talking about what's happening in the Middle East and also about the basic themes of your book, last week, a good friend of and a colleague of yours, Ambassador Martin Indyk, passed away. And I know you worked very closely. And let me just remind our listeners and viewers that he served twice as U.S. Ambassador to Israel from 1995 to 97, and again from 2000 to 2001, had many important positions in the Department of State, and I guess one of his last positions was serving as President Obama's special envoy to Israel-Palestinian negotiations. He visited many World Affairs Councils when he was on his book tour for that superb publication, Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. But tell us what you think about Martin. What are your memories?
Well, I have to say, it is such an unbelievable loss for the council and personally. Martin was unfailingly gracious in a town like Washington, where there are the caricature is it's a town of not very nice people, and some of that is quite accurate. Martin was always unfailingly gracious to everyone. I was remarking to a colleague the other day that there isn't anybody who works in the Middle East policy community in Washington, D.C. who wasn't touched by Martin in some way, whether as he was their boss, their mentor, their friend, their sounding board, their wise man. My origin story with Martin is I was 22 years old, which is a lot longer ago than I like to admit. And I spotted him across the room at a reception that my then employer, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, was holding for the delegations to the multilateral peace talks. This was something that came out of the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. And I asked someone if they knew Martin. They said yes. And I said, would you mind introducing me? And they brought me over and introduced me to Martin. After just chatting for a few minutes, he took out his card. He said, here's my card. Call my office, make an appointment. And I did. It was like gold to me to have Martin Indyk's card. I'd read everything he'd written. I'd admired him from afar. And I went over to his office and we spent 45 minutes talking about my background, my goals, my career. And he found out that I was moving to the Middle East and I was going to go to Jerusalem. I was going to move to Jerusalem. And he took out a book with business cards and he gave me 5 names of people he thought would be interesting for me to meet based on my interests. And I went on my way. And I didn't work for him. I had just met him very briefly at a reception. And he didn't really have to do that. And I think it was all those many, many years ago, but I think it speaks volumes about who Martin was and who he was up until the very, very end. And it's a tremendous professional and personal loss. And I think I'm not the only one who is saying that today.
Well, thank you for sharing that. One thing that I'm always curious about, especially since I also spent and did my graduate work in the Middle East, what led you to specialize in a region which is not known for calmness?
Maybe it's because I'm not necessarily calm. I mean, just wind me up and I keep going. I think there's a longer history of it, but really, I think the most important moment was when the hostages were taken in the embassy in Tehran in November 1979. Both of my parents were born during World War II, and were Kennedy and Johnson liberals. And I grew up, on the idea of the positive use of American power, whether at home or abroad, that, the United States had saved the world from Nazism, it was facing down communism, and that we could actually do good in the world. And it was striking to me as a sixth grader at the time that there were millions of people in the streets of this city called Tehran in this country called Iran screaming death to America. This was absolutely fascinating to me, and I became deeply, deeply interested in the topic, to the point where my parents let me, a few nights of the week, as the crisis went on, ABC News launched a program after the local news. It started from 11:30, went from 11:30 to 11:45. It was called Nightline, America Held Hostage.
Ted
And it was
Koppel.
hosted by a then very unknown Ted Koppel, backbencher. They didn't know what to do with him. They threw him on TV at 11:30. And a few nights a week, my parents let me stay up to watch it. Of course, I don't want to exaggerate. The Middle East wasn't my entire life. I was a soccer player. I chased after girls, music, all the kinds of things that, kids who are growing up and becoming teenagers do. But then when I went to college, it was clear that I wanted to be an international studies major with a focus on the Middle East. And I think that was that moment in sixth grade. And then my sophomore year of college, when I declared a major, I had a wonderful professor who was Iranian American, who taught the political economy of Iran. And she really put the bug in me. Of course, I don't focus on Iran, but just that's how it became a wativerful, interesting, enriching career in life,
And
despite all the problems of the Middle East.
That was at Vassar, and then you got your doctorate at Penn. It's funny that you said that someone who really influenced you was an Iranian American at the University of Virginia, and why I went there was because of Rui Ramazani, who was, of course, Iranian American. So one of the things, of course, is a theme of your book is that so many American presidents entered office thinking, do I have to be involved with the Middle East? And continuing today, there's a debate about retrenchment, engagement. But you talk about how perhaps we've been too negative about our role in the past, not talking about today, but in the past. Give us your thoughts about why we shouldn't be quite so negative.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I actually went into this project thinking that I was just going to focus on, how the United States had just failed in the Middle East. And what I discovered was that there were distinct periods in the region. And if you take the period arguably from the end of the Second World War up to 1991, the United States was more successful than people imagine. Certainly by dint of what American policymakers wanted to do in the Middle East, they were successful. Of course, there were setbacks and there were moral costs to this, but the United States during that period really, and really, this took off really in the early 1970s. The United States had three very specific things that it wanted to do in the Middle East during this period. One, prevent threats to the free flow of oil out of the region. Second, to help prevent threats to Israeli security, and to prevent a country or combination of countries from threatening America's primacy in the region. And by every measure you can imagine, those things happened. There was only one moment when oil was used as a weapon in 1973, and it was a very short period. Of course, Americans who were alive at the time remember a deep and painful recession. I was alive at that time, and the only thing I really remember is sitting in the back of my father's Chevy for hours waiting for gas. But the actual oil embargo was only for a few months. There were, of course, setbacks like the Iranian Revolution, moral costs because the United States relied on authoritarian governments as its partners in the region, moral costs, how the United States contributed to and continues to enable the permanent statelessness of the Palestinian people. But given if you use as a yardstick what it was that policymakers wanted to do, the oil flowed, Israel remained secure, and the United States remained the predominant external power in the region. That was a period of, I think, success. It came to an end, however.
And another thing that you made me think about in reading your book is, I remember very well Nixon's twin pillar policy. And yet there was other names. I mean, everybody has to have a name for their foreign policy. And you talk about the Carter Doctrine, the Reagan Corollary. And yet people say often that US foreign policy is like a ship. It's very hard to turn. And so our policy really didn't change with these presidents, did it? It was still the focus on oil.
It was just different means of achieving that goal. So the Nixon doctrine in the Middle East played out as the twin pillar strategy, and the twin pillars were Saudi Arabia and Iran. Twin, as I write in the book, makes it sound like they were equal, but really Iran was the major focus of American foreign policy, and that the Shah's Iran would be the policeman for the United States of the Gulf. And in fact was at times quite helpful. There was an uprising against in Oman, and there was great fear that Oman would fall to, communist or Arab nationalist elements that would be hostile to the United States, creating yet another challenge to the free flow of energy resources out of the Gulf. And the Iranians dispatched forces to Oman to help to help the Omani authorities put it down. In Saudi Arabia, the primary goal was to ensure the security of the House of Saud, believing that the House of Saud was the key to the continued free flow of energy resources out of the region. So the United States reorganized the Saudi Arabian National Guard and provided all kinds of means to ensure that, help the House of Saud ensure its own stability. That actually, neither of those things worked very well. You have the setback of the Iranian Revolution, and you have the taking of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, all around the same time, that really shook America's confidence in the Nixon doctrine. And that led to the Carter Doctrine, which was a clear enunciation of the United States would defend the oil fields of the Gulf from external threats. And here President Carter was responding to something else that happened in those 7 weeks in 1979, which was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And that really committed the United States to a defense of the region. And then, of course, the Reagan Corollary, which wasn't written down like the Carter Doctrine, but that came with, obviously, President Reagan, in which he established that the United States would not only defend the oil fields of the Gulf from external threats, but also internal threats. And here he was thinking specifically about post-revolutionary Iran. And from there, those are the countries, that's how we get this vector of American, the very large, over a long period of time, very large American military presence in the region, and heavy American diplomatic presence and involvement in the politics of the region.
When was CENTCOM established as a force?
So CENTCOM, the idea for CENTCOM goes back to this era, but of course during this era, and it was if you're old enough to remember, there was a discussion about a rapid reaction force, which morphed into CENTCOM in the late 1970s, kind of formally established at that time, but no basing in the region. And so CENTCOM, which is responsible for the Middle East from a huge, vast amount of territory, was based in Tampa, Florida. Right. It now, subsequently, beginning in the mid and late 1970s, had a near permanent presence in the region in the form of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and access to bases all around the region, including a naval base in Bahrain. But it's a relatively new combatant command, only going back now less than 50 years, but has been a central focus and instrument of American power for quite some time, given everything that we've tried to do in the Middle East.
Yeah. Let me remind all of you that I like, and Stephen does too, to take your questions during our conversation. So go ahead and put them into the Q&A, and I'll get to them as quickly as I can. And also, it'd be great to hear where you're from. So if you can just put your city there as well. So then we get to 1991, 1992, and we've won, we think.
Right.
Talk about this period of time
Well, so
when,
this is, yeah, this is my demarcation line, is 1991, where we went from this period of success, albeit with setbacks and moral costs, to a period of failure. And that failure starts with two spectacular victories. One coming on February 26, 1991, when Saddam Hussein waves the white flag after he's pushed out of Kuwait. And the second one comes exactly 10 months later, when the hammer and sickle comes down for the last time over the Kremlin, and the Soviet Union ceases to exist. It had been collapsing for some time, but on the day after Christmas in 1991, the Soviet Union comes to an end finally. And the United States stood alone in the world with a surfeit of power and not a clear idea what to do with it, except for the idea that the United States could now use its power in the world to, as I write in the book, make good things happen. And so the debates, the bruising debates about expanding NATO begin around that time. Economic shock therapy to bring the economies of Central and Eastern Europe into the global economy. And when we cast our gaze at the Middle East, we looked at a region which had missed the third wave of democratization, coming from Latin America and Eastern and Central Europe, and was, with the exception of Africa, but we weren't as interested in Africa in the eyes of American policymakers at the time, in most need of American help. And so ambitious ideas about the transformation of the region start bubbling up and actually become operationalized in the early to mid 1990s. And that's where we start getting ourselves into trouble.
So when you use the word transformation, at that time, not post 9/11, but in this late 1990s, what do you mean?
Well, so this is one of the things that I think is important in the book, is that many people go back to 9/11 and the post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as kind of the starting point of American failure in the region. And what I discovered in the course of the research for the book is that actually the seeds of these failures were planted in the decade before, and all the debates about the use of American power in the region in the decade before. It's interesting. We have, people who are coming into positions of influence and foreign policy responsibility in the United States who have been so affected by the attacks on New York and Washington on September 11, 2001, that it's almost as if that's when history starts. And history clearly didn't. And clearly in the Middle East, it didn't. And in the 1990s, do you remember, President Bill Clinton declared that he wanted to pull the countries of the Middle East into the 21st century. And the way that he was going to do that was by forging peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And that would in turn undermine, now that would be a good peace between Israelis and Palestinians, would be very good. And it would undermine the rationale for the big national security states of the Arab world, leading to more open and democratic societies in those countries. I think it was elegant talking about it in conference rooms in Washington, D.C., but it didn't really get at what the reason was, why there were these authoritarian systems in the region. It's not because of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, although that conflict was leveraged by authoritarian leaders. Interesting, going back to Martin. Martin wrote about this in his first book, Innocents Abroad, in which he kind of said, we charged into this whole thing and we thought we could get, 5 peace agreements and that it would transform the region. And after 8 years working at this, I realized how actually innocent we were when we started this after President Clinton became president. It was really actually, and again, I'm gonna be critical of my colleagues in Washington, but in a town where people say, I was wrong, but I was right in my wrongness. It was refreshing when I read Innocent Abroad, which is a great book and at times laugh out loud funny. That Martin just straight up said, we were innocent. We had no idea that we were going into this buzzsaw. And so that was the first kind of transformational thing. And in the background of this was, of course, the bruising debates about what to do about Iraq.
Yeah.
And there was, and I remind people that this was a time where there was a lot of activity about and a lot of debates about the need for the transformation of Iraq. That Iraq was this unique threat to the world.
Now, when are we talking about this? What
the mid-1990s.
Okay.
The mid-1990s. These are the seeds of all of this. I remember I was a student at John. I went to Vassar, took a few years off, then did my master's degree at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies before doing my PhD at Penn. And who was my dean at SAIS? Paul Wolfowitz. And I remember that Paul Wolfowitz, it was actually, I had come back to SAIS. I was visiting Washington a couple of years after I graduated. I was already doing my PhD. And I was at an event at SAIS and we got to talking and he said, oh, Middle East, right. And he gave me his whole plan for the transformation of Iraq. But these debates were going on at that time. This was the mid and late 1990s.
Okay.
And people forget that President Clinton, I mean, he was triangulating as he famously did, but he was the guy behind the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998, which had bipartisan support. I like to remind people on the progressive end of the political spectrum that Bernie Sanders voted for the Iraq Liberation Act. I mean, this was truly a bipartisan affair. And then, of course,
but it was also
happens.
Because we were in opposition to Iran at that time. I mean, it was a way to build, right?
Well, this was an era of again, going back to Martin, of dual containment. We were containing both Iraq and Iran at the same time. Although even in that, there was this idea that somehow,
well, let's jump forward. And Stephen, let me say, we are going to try to talk a bit about Turkey, but we'll get to that later. So 9/11 happens, and George W. Bush campaigned and thought he was going to be the domestic president,
right?
And that, of course, did not turn out to be the situation. And there was this freedom agenda, and I'm going to ask Abby just to show this picture of Condoleezza Rice in Cairo, but give us the background and sort of the framework of how George W. Bush saw this and how this led later to our work with the Arab Spring.
Yeah, so in the immediate post 9/11 environment, policymakers were sort of grasping for what to do, not just what to do to confront the threat from Al-Qaeda. That was clearly, they had decided on a military response to it, and I think there was broad American support for that. But then there was this question, and if you remember this era very clearly, you'll remember this. There was this: how do we, quote unquote, drain the swamp? That was the mantra within the administration in Washington, and policymakers were grasping for how do you do that, and pulling books off shelves, reading things. They kind of stitched together the idea that democracy would drain the swamp, quote unquote, drain the swamp of predominantly young men who wanted to take up arms against their states and ultimately the United States. That democracy would be an antidote to terrorism. Therefore, the United States should promote democracy around the region because alienated, mostly young men would, in democratic systems, have the ability to process their grievances through institutions rather than at the end of a gun or.
And Stephen, let me just jump in because when I read the Freedom Agenda, I went to internet and pulled up the White House statement. And this is President Bush has advanced liberty and democracy as the great alternatives to repression and radicalism, quote, George W. Bush, by working to spread liberty in these volatile regions and combating the conditions that can breed extremism, the president has helped make the American people safer.
There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that democracy is an antidote to terrorism. But nevertheless, we then went on this kind of adventure to promote democracy in the Arab world. Now, let me just say, I believe there are millions of people in the Arab countries and Arab societies who want to live in more democratic and open systems. Absolutely. But what I don't think they wanted was the United States to bring it to them, and certainly not at the end of a tank like we tried to do in Iraq. This was this kind of benign Pax Americana that people imagine, that in the aftermath of 9/11 we could transform these societies and that people wouldn't resist what we were doing. Even those who wanted to live in democratic systems didn't want the United States coming in and kind of transforming their societies. And I think it became clear very quickly that the United States didn't have the resources, the insight, the knowledge, the ability to transform these societies. You put that picture up of Condoleezza Rice. It was very, very interesting to read her memoirs. Everybody quotes the famous quote is, for 60 years we supported authoritarians in the region based on this idea of authoritarian stability, and we didn't get any, and now the time has changed. But she went on in that speech in an even more fulsome way, talking about how that we should transform the societies in the Middle East for our own security. There is one debate about this, though. People would say, and including my direct boss at the Council on Foreign Relations, Jim Lindsay, would say, hey, look, the Iraq War was all about security. It was about disarming Iraq. That's everybody in the bureaucracy could agree on that. It wasn't about promoting democracy. My answer to him is, Jim, that's 100% right. But when Donald Rumsfeld proposed overthrowing Saddam Hussein and then finding some other Iraqi general to take his place, the president of the United States said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to just recreate another authoritarian system. We're going to build a democracy in Iraq if we're going to disarm Iraq. So this is a through line. This democracy thing is a through line, not just in countering terrorism and freedom agenda and the transformation of Iraq, but also in Palestinian-Israeli arena. Remember, Bill Clinton wanted to promote peace because he believed that would get to reform. George W. Bush flipped that logic on its head and said, we can only get peace after there's reform. And so there was a lot of pressure on Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority to reform and undertake democratic reform on the theory that that would produce a more democratic polity in Palestine that would be more readily make peace with Israel, which was also a misreading of the politics of Palestine and Palestinian society.
So later we have the Arab Spring. I mean, we're jumping around a bit, but the hubris, I think we would say, that of regime change, and we can look at the 4 or 5 Arab leaders that met their untimely demise, and here they come. I mean, Saddam Hussein, of course, Mubarak, Gaddafi, and Ben Ali. And so how did we really not understand that regime change was not enough? You've touched on that, but it really was just incredible lack of understanding.
Right. What's interesting about this photo is that, of course, we overthrew Saddam Hussein and were unable to then forge the democracy that we envisioned in Iraq. It was, as I write in the book, kind of a Washington, D.C. fever dream. Mubarak and Ben Ali came first in the Arab Spring, and then Mubarak were brought down by huge protests in their countries, a popular uprising that convinced security forces that these guys had to go because they put the social cohesion of those countries in jeopardy. And then, of course, there was Gaddafi, who was chased out of Tripoli by a popular uprising, but the United States and NATO helped in that process. The outcome across all of those in terms of democratic change is basically the same. Not in Iraq, not in Egypt, not in Libya, and not in Tunisia. And Tunisia was held up as the quote unquote one Arab Spring success story. Has there been a blossoming of democracy? I do want to point out, though, that Tunisia in particular was an uprising that surprised everybody in Washington. And we had nothing to do with it. We had nothing to do with what was happening in Egypt also. And in Libya, similar kind of thing. We came in because we were concerned about a massacre of people in Benghazi, and we felt that we had this moral obligation to protect them. But these uprisings were spontaneous. They were not and nothing that the United States did during the Freedom Agenda period, which was earlier in the decade, had any bearing on the hope for political changes as a result of the uprisings in Arab countries later on.
So let me bring in Robert Larrick into the conversation. He has several questions. Won't be able to get to all of them, but he goes, why are we so reluctant or scared to discuss the religious and political positions or attitudes versus just military hard power post 9/11? Military power has not worked very well.
I think that's right when you think about military power in terms of our transformational goals. I mean, I think military power has been effective in containing the threat from Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which remains ever present, but not the kind of threat that it was early on. I think what this question of religion and culture comes up all the time. I think there's kind of two answers. There's two answers to this. One, there is a cultural issue here, and that is that we believe that the world wants our culture. There was a theory in the social sciences in the 50s and 1960s that at some stage of development, all the countries will converge and we'll all kind of look the same. And that kind of, first of all, that theory was debunked, but it created this idea, and the legacy of that idea in Washington is that everybody wanted to be just like us. And I think that a lot of people like our culture. I think they admire our institutions, but they don't necessarily want it for themselves. So I think that's one thing. I think it's hard for Americans to get our minds around the fact that maybe people don't necessarily want our culture, even though they enjoy it. And then this is kind of a tricky argument, and I've tried it out on people, and I've gotten in a little bit of trouble, but I'm going to try it out on people as well. You think about a place like Tunisia. Are we convinced that protesters in Tunisia after Ben Ali fell, and then the country was racked by protests in some years afterwards, are we convinced that they were protesting because they wanted democracy, or were they convinced, or were they protesting because the new government wasn't producing the outcomes that they wanted? So,
well, I would say
would they have been satisfied? So the question is, would they have been satisfied with a more effective big Arab national security state? And I wonder if that's the case. And I have a feeling that, based purely anecdotal, I don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, but that the authoritarian systems themselves have a cultural legacy that breeds this idea of the big Arab state being able to provide for their people, and that if only they were more effective, then there wouldn't be an uprising. That necessarily the demand for democracy actually happened, but subsequently that demand for democracy was less than the demand for rebuilding this social contract that was at the heart of these national security states.
Well, as some of our viewers know, I have and you certainly know, a special interest in Tunisia. And I could talk and with you about Tunisia for the rest of the time, but we won't do that.
When I tried that argument out in terms of Tunisia after Kais Saied's coup in 2021, oh, did I get in trouble? I got canceled on Twitter for a couple of days.
No, but I think you're absolutely right, because people were really looking for job opportunities. The unemployment was so high, and the corruption in the country. But what I want to do is go off sort of the Arab world for a few minutes and talk about Turkey. Let's do that for about 4 or 5 minutes, because we have several questions on Turkey. From Stephen Shore, the role of Turkey is not often dealt with. What is the future of its role in the Middle East? He's from Santa Fe. Thank you, Stephen. And another question on Turkey from Greg Gosek. Why has Turkey been a peripheral player in the region for many years? and Erdogan's efforts to focus east instead of west have significant Middle Eastern consequences. And Greg is from Illinois. Thank you both.
Yeah, so those are great questions. And actually Turkey, over the course of the last 2 decades has become a much more important player in the Middle East. And Turkey's sort of, there's been some cycles of Turkey in the Middle East over those 20 years. And Jim, if you'll let me just kind of explain that for a second, is that after the Justice and Development Party came to power in 2002, a party of an Islamist party, the latest iteration at the time of Turkish Islamism. It was notable because, one, it was determined to get a formal invitation to join the European Union, and unlike previous governments, determined to play an important role in the Middle East. And this was a time where the Turks held themselves out as problem solvers and troubleshooters because they could talk to everybody in the region: Israelis, Palestinians, everybody, Saudis, Qataris, Lebanese, whoever. They could talk to them. And that was the sort of the rise of the AKP and the mythology of the AKP in the Middle East. Post-Arab uprisings, the Turks sort of overplayed their hand. They saw themselves as, even though they rejected the idea of a Turkish model, which was all the rage in Washington at the time, they did see themselves as sort of the model, as the ones who could bring along Arab countries and help them with soft landings and transitions. And there was a lot of interest in this in the Arab world. There was this idea that Turkey had solved the problem of the accumulation of Islamist power. But they overplayed their hands. I was in Egypt when Erdogan arrived for his first post-Mubarak visit to Egypt, and the Egyptians were absolutely offended by this idea that this Turk was going to come in and tell them, country with 7,500 years of history, al Dunya, mother of the world, tell them what to do. And then, of course, there was the coup in Egypt, and the support for the coup of Egypt from critical countries around the region, Israel, the UAE, and the Saudis, who basically bankrolled the coup and refloated the Egyptian economy, the Bahrainis. And because Erdogan, given who he is and his background, was outraged by the coup, it led to a significant and sharp deterioration of Turkey's strategic position in the region, and about a decade of Turkey's conflictual relations with countries in the region and in the Eastern Mediterranean, including Greece, Cyprus, which led to a sort of bandwagoning effect against Turkey. And then more recently, the Turks have sought to repair their relations with all of these governments, and we're on the cusp of a major normalization with the Israelis when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, and Turkey is now throwing its weight around as a patron of Hamas and the Palestinian people, and in fact, just the other day, threatening to invade Israel, which is just bluster, but gives you a sense of where they are. But the Turks see themselves, and the Turks have sought a foreign policy that is strategically independent from its NATO partners, particularly the United States, because they see themselves as a European power, a Central Asian power, a power in the Caucasus, a Middle Eastern power, and importantly for Erdogan, a Muslim power. And so they've been playing a bigger role, previously more constructive than more recently.
Thank you. Talking about another country is China, and let me blend these two questions together. One from Ray Termini, who's in Dallas, and is the U.S. still the indispensable party in the Middle East? Does the Chinese brokering of the Saudi-Iranian normalization agreement show a weakening of the U.S. role? And then Scott is writing in from Charlotte. Can you address how China has influenced the direction of the Middle East, especially in the last 2 decades?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. The Chinese phenomenon in the region. Let me just start out by saying 2 things by way of caveat. At the level of abstraction, the United States and China sort of have very, very similar interests in the region. The free flow of energy resources from the region, freedom of navigation in the waterways around and in the region, stability. In practice, this doesn't actually work itself out. So hold on to that for a second.
Okay.
And then the other caveat. Leaders in the region like Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the UAE, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Emir Tamim from Qatar, the ruling family in Bahrain, even the Egyptians, the Israelis, no one rolls out of bed in the morning in the Middle East and looks towards Beijing. They're all inclined towards the West, but particularly the United States. Mm-hmm. But they look at everything the United States has done from arguably 2003 all the way up through today, and they can make a story. They could, based in evidence, that everything the United States has done has been to the advantage of Iran, and that in this desire for the United States to pivot to Asia, the United States is turning its back on the region and leaving the region to the mercy of the Iranians. Now, whether that interpretation is true or not, that's the way they can give you a coherent, logical story about everything that we've done, and that is the result. And I got to be honest with you, as an objective analyst of the region, there's a certain amount of truth to this. And so this has encouraged them. And add to that over the course of the last decade, the debate, in which I talk a lot about in the book, in Washington has been that the United States should leave the region. Withdrawal, retrenchment, offshore balancing. This is what they hear, and it has encouraged critical partners of the United States to hedge with the Chinese. Now,
so remind us, Stephen, about 2019 and where that really affected the Saudis.
So I was getting there, but thanks, because I could go on for hours, and we don't have hours, Jim. In 2019 was a very bad summer. The Iranians were taking oil tankers and bunkering ships in the Persian Gulf. They shot down an American surveillance drone operating in international airspace in the Gulf. And it culminated in the Iranian attack on an oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia, which is the largest oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia, called Albuquerque, and another major oil facility called Khurais. And taking about 50% of Saudi Arabia's supply off of the market, prompting me to call everybody in my family, better go fill up your tanks with gas. What I didn't know at the time is how much spare capacity the Saudis had. So there wasn't this massive spike in gas prices. But the important point was that the Saudis thought, okay, harder doctrine, Reagan corollary, the cavalry is going to come. And President Trump said, they attacked Saudi Arabia, not us. I'm waiting for a call from Riyadh. And essentially saying, we're not going to respond to this major provocation from the Iranians. And this was the one moment of bipartisan agreement in Washington. All the Democrats, all the major Democrats said, oh yeah, we're not going to defend Mohammed bin Salman, the murderer of Jamal Khashoggi. Mm-hmm. And so we walked away from this. And this freaked out the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others, because it was a clear manifestation that the United States, despite words about commitment to security and stability in the region, was being feckless. And this encouraged more hedging with Chinese and Russians, to be quite honest with you. In an amazing troll, Russian President Vladimir Putin offered the Saudis the Russian-made S-400 air defense system, which we were fighting with the Turks about because the Turks had acquired the same system. Amazing.
So my friend, I wish we had a lot more time because there's so many things that we will not have time to discuss.
I'm just getting warmed up.
But that's why people have to buy the book, right?
Sure.
So let's talk about Israel. Let me just tell you about one or two of the questions that are here so that you can perhaps work those in. One from Richard Lombardi. Is the world finally calling the U.S. out for our human rights hypocrisy with Israel? Torture, taking land by force, etc. Will the world keep just accepting it? And then another question about Israel, about the two-state solution. Can we get there? But you wrote a whole chapter, and it was a lengthy chapter about Israel. So give us your thoughts. And my question along that is, you turned this in right after October 7th. And would you write the same chapter today?
So at first, let me just say you should have seen the first chapter, which was over 100 pages. The first draft, it was over 100 pages long on the Israel front. And don't worry, readers, the entire book now is only 150 pages, with 30 some odd pages of end matter.
And well written too.
Thank you very much. And then I actually finished the manuscript and it went into production on July 15th, 2003. But after the war began, my editor called and said, we think you need to really account for what's happening. I said, of course, the good news is everything that I talk about in the book is perfectly consistent with what is happening right now, how the Biden administration would respond, how opponents of Israel would respond, and the ensuing debates about Israel. And this gets to the questions. On the question of Israel's human rights violations, its annexation of territory that everybody agrees should be for a Palestinian state, in some modicum of justice for these people who have been rendered stateless all of these years, I think the world has for a long time called out the United States for its double standards when it comes to Israel. And we have double standards everywhere when we deal with our allies. But of course, we have a special relationship. With Israel. And I think the world is calling it out. I think what's more important is that the politics of the U.S.-Israel relationship is changing in the United States. That where there was once bipartisan consensus, and those issues, those problems, those very significant concerns about Israeli conduct, its human rights violations, its annexation of Palestinian territory, were kind of ignored. They're now getting much more attention in the policy community, and that you can see just by the polling, and not just polling going back to October 7th, 2023 forward, but there was an extraordinary poll done by Gallup last spring, which demonstrated that more Democrats than Republicans were sympathetic to more Democrats were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than Democrats were to Israel. The first time that ever happened. But of course, Israel enjoys very, very strong support within the Republican Party. And the polls overall haven't actually really moved all that much. Israel enjoys about 53% support from the American people. But undoubtedly, it's the case that and I write about this in the book, that in the next 15, 20 years, the U.S.-Israel relationship is going to be very, very different, because that bipartisan consensus on support for Israel is really breaking down. And this war has accelerated the process that was already underway. And I offer some ways to deal with this legacy interest of the United States. On the question of a two-state solution, look, I'm the hanging judge in Washington on this. I've been saying for years, it's not 5 minutes to midnight, but it's actually 1:45. And that there is no two-state solution. If you just go out there and you take a look at what the Israelis have done in the West Bank, the massive settlements, some of these settlements are larger than the town that I grew up in, and I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. These are little cities. So I think that the United States talks about a two-state solution, but it's for lack of owning up to what really is the case, which is essentially the permanent statelessness of the Palestinian people. What I always say is, look, there is no two-state solution at a structural level. Even if you had, let's imagine for a moment that the most dynamic parties in the Israeli political arena isn't the radical right that wants to annex the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that the most dynamic part of Palestinian politics isn't Hamas. I mean, you have these mirror images. They're both one-staters. They're both one-staters. Hamas attacked because they want to liberate all of Palestine, which is genocidal. And the Israeli right wants to annex territory and engage in ethnic cleansing. These are one-staters. But let's imagine for a second, in a fantasy world, we have a Palestinian leadership that is competent, whatever, and wants to negotiate with the Israelis, and the Israelis have the same thing. No Israeli government can satisfy the minimum Palestinian demands for peace. Jerusalem is capital, a contiguous Palestinian state, and the return of some Palestinian right of return. And no Palestinian leader can provide Israel's minimum demands for peace, which is Jerusalem, united eternal capital of the Jewish people. No going back to the June 4, 1967 armistice lines, and no right of return. This is a Jewish state.
Yeah.
So there is no two-state solution.
So I want to be sure we leave time to talk about your political science term, prudential conservatism. But before we do that, Stephen, Jen asks, what might we expect with a new administration?
Hard to say, actually. And which administration?
Right.
Right. So I think with a
Give me a minute on each one.
I once described Trump's foreign policy as a lazy Susan. It spins, an issue comes up, he spends a day or two on it, he gets exhausted with it, he's no longer interested, he moves on to the next thing. Like the Venezuela coup, remember that? The deal of the century, all of these kinds of things. I think that Trump is motivated in the Middle East when it comes to Israel in terms of an evangelical base that supports maximal Israeli policies in the region. What he has said to Netanyahu is finish it. Which also the vice president and presumptive Democratic nominee has said finish it. But I think what Trump says is, what he means by it is use all means necessary to finally get this thing over. I think that the vice president is tied to the policy that the president she served carved out. She is someone who has consistently voiced her support for Israel and Israel's right to defend itself and the ironclad commitments, which are informal, that the United States has to helping ensure Israeli security. But she has also been willing at critical moments to speak out about and have empathy for the suffering of the Palestinian people. And that would suggest that at the very least, there might be a different tone in a Harris White House with regard to the war and the relationship with Israel than there is with the Biden administration. President Biden's like old school, been in the Senate for 46 years. Can't talk about Israel without mentioning the words Golda Meir. I mean, Golda Meir. I think his vice president barely remembers Golda Meir. So this is, I think there'll be at least a difference in tone, if not overall policy. And, that change that I was talking about hasn't really fully emerged. Votes in Congress on Israel are still lopsided in Israel's favor.
Right.
But I think there will be probably a change in tone.
Ghassan El-Aid, I'm sorry I didn't read your question. I just saw it now, but I hope you got the answer that we were talking about the peace process a few minutes ago. What is this prudential conservatism? And I guess it's a good way to begin to conclude and close, because that's your forecast or your recommendation going forward.
Yeah. So in the last chapter of the book, I highlight what I think are 6 priorities for the United States in the region, and that's it. And that's what we should devote our resources to. And in reading the draft, my former boss, Richard Haas, who, gave just extraordinarily sound advice on the book after a couple of drafts had been written. He said, look, this is all well and good, but you need to call it something. And so he said, call it something. And I said, what do you mean call it something? He said, call it something, have a concept. And so I went back to my office and I kind of stared at the walls and started Googling terms. And what was it that I was trying to get at? And what I was trying to get at overall was to say that the United States has a tremendous amount of power, but we have to be judicious in its use and particular about what we devote our resources to defend, sacrifice for, and invest in. And so in kind of thinking through this, prudential, kind of prudence, and small c, conservatism, to conserve. The idea that in the previous era, when we were ambitiously trying to transform the region, everything was a critical national interest of the United States. Therefore, nothing was. And this is my plea to my colleagues in Washington and policymakers, is like, let's focus on what's important and devote resources to those things. And those resources are actually finite for as wealthy as we are, because we have other priorities in the world. There's a war in Europe. There's a rising power in Asia. There's all kinds of things that demand our attention. And I mention Asia and Europe because those are critical core interests. to the United States, as well as in many ways the security and stability of the Middle East, because it's truly in the middle.
And as we conclude, we have a few questions about Hamas and Israel war. Any hope?
I'm the wrong person to ask. I again feeling like the hanging judge here, and I'm generally a sunny person. Like I like people and so on and so forth, but I can't find a silver lining here whatsoever. Early on in the conflict, people said, "Isn't opportunity comes from crisis?" I said, but also bad actors see that too, and so you see that in the radical right in Israel who want to settle the Gaza Strip. You see that in the kind of empowered way Hamas has sought to, their goal to liberate all of Israel and to continue the fight. I think that the more likely outcome of this conflict, if and when, God willing, soon it ends, but it's not going to end well. It's going to end in a way that goes back to some version of the status quo, but updated. So what the Israelis are saying is, we're going to do Gaza the same way we do the West Bank, which gives us access to these areas so that we can engage in counterterrorism operations. And they're already building roads to allow them to do this.
Well, when you see Clarissa Ward heading to Jerusalem, that's not a good sign, CNN's International Post.
I mean, that's about what's going to happen in terms of Iran's retaliation for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran yesterday. Go ahead. Sorry, Jim.
Well, when we talk about a regional war, I mean, what do we really mean by that? I mean, I get Iran, Israel, and the proxies, but do you see other Arab country coming in?
No. I think the Gulf states have made a strategic decision to normalize with Israel, and this is an obstacle to it, a significant one. But when Iran attacked Israel, they were fully on board in providing a whole host of technical assistance to Israel and the United States to defend Israel from that attack. Now, there's a lot of pressure on King Abdullah of Jordan, just for one example, that in this situation, a lot of political pressure on him under the current circumstances, that the Jordanian Air Force should stand down. But they were all full partners with the Israelis. I think there is a regional war. The question is the intensification of it, and it's a regional war that pits Israel and the United States against Iran and Iran's proxies.
What type of pressure, though, does the Arab Street have on MBS or King of Morocco? Or
look, I think someone like Abdel Fattah Sisi, the president of Egypt, is feeling the heat. He's in a particularly awkward position, and that's why he's done some of the things that he has done with regard to Israel, and been very, very outspoken and critical of the Israelis. It also puts King Abdullah of Jordan, which has a population that is 65% plus Palestinian, in a very, very difficult and awkward position. When it comes to the small Gulf states, like the UAE, and public opinion really doesn't matter there.
Right.
In Saudi Arabia, which has a significant population, what the Saudis are worried about, I was there in April and May, was that they had a population that was obviously not enthusiastic about the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I think the support for it was in single digits in Saudi Arabia. But now, after these 10 months of war, people watching it unfold in real time, you have people who've once again been mobilized on the Palestine issue.
Let me just put in a plug, because I know you draw on it too, for the Arab Barometer. You can just go to that.
Arab Barometer is fantastic.
Because we talked about how people are looking at democracy in a number of states, and they do that. And of course, they've been doing surveys. Dr. Stephen Cook, thank you, sir. Great to be with you.
It's my great pleasure. Like I said, I was just getting warmed up. Thank you so much, Jim, for the time and the World Affairs Council, sponsors, and everybody with the questions. I wish I had the opportunity to answer everybody's questions.
Well, I know you're going to many other cities, so you'll have a chance, and we look forward to seeing you in Santa Fe, and I know Dallas as well. And to all of you, thanks so much for being a part of tonight's program. We really, really appreciate our partners, the Committees on Foreign Relations, the World Affairs Councils, It means the world to us. If you've enjoyed the program or want to share it with other people, it'll be up on YouTube as well as a podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast, and watch it on YouTube. Give us a review, contact us, give us your thoughts. And we have a program coming up in, I believe, September 23rd, I think yeah, I got that date right. I'm reading Max Boot's book now. I got about 150 pages to go. It is great. You'll really enjoy it. And we just flew through the screen with Mickey Bergman. He's celebrating tonight to a degree because he was involved in some of the hostage rescue. I was in touch with him today, and he said he's celebrating in one way and he's very unhappy in other ways because there's still American hostages in some countries, and he'll be working on that, so you may want to listen to that. But again, thanks to all of you, and pick up a copy of Stephen's book. It's well worth your time, and as he said, it's only 150 pages. We'll see you next time on World Now with Jim Falk. Good night.